No Chinese army is marching toward your country. No Chinese soldier is standing outside your home. No Chinese flag is being raised above your city. And yet, China may already be inside your house. The phone in your hand, the screen you are watching, the battery powering your device, the machines inside your factories, the cranes building your roads, the cameras watching your streets. Even the medicines, clothes, and household objects surrounding you may depend, directly or indirectly, on China. Only a few generations ago, China was devastated by invasion, civil war, famine, political chaos, and extreme poverty. Today, it possesses the world's largest high-speed railway network, dominates major manufacturing supply chains, and files more patent applications than any other country. So how did an ancient empire that was broken, invaded, and humiliated become one of the most advanced nations on Earth? To understand that transformation, we must travel more than 2,000 years into the past. Back to approximately 100 BC. Around 100 BC, much of Europe was divided among kingdoms, tribes, and expanding Roman power. But thousands of kilometers to the east, China was already governed by one of history's great imperial systems, the Han Dynasty. The Han Empire maintained roads, taxation systems, organized armies, government offices, and an educated civil administration. Its rulers governed millions of people across an enormous territory. Under Emperor Wu, Chinese influence expanded toward Central Asia. Trade routes connecting China with distant regions grew into the network we now call the Silk Roads. Silk, horses, metals, spices, glass, ideas, and religions traveled across these routes. Chinese silk eventually reached as far as the Roman world. This was not merely trade, it was an early form of globalization. China was not isolated from the ancient world. It stood at one end of one of history's greatest networks of commerce and cultural exchange. And over the following centuries, Chinese scholars, engineers, and craftsmen produced inventions that would transform human civilization. Paper made knowledge cheaper to record. Printing allowed information to spread. The compass helped sailors cross oceans. Gunpowder changed warfare forever. These inventions were not created together or by one dynasty, but they became symbols of China's extraordinary scientific and technological history. China also developed advanced iron production, complex irrigation systems, enormous canals, sophisticated mathematics, astronomical observations, and one of the world's most competitive civil service traditions. For centuries, government officials could be selected through demanding examinations rather than simply inheriting their positions. It was imperfect, frequently corrupt, and limited largely to educated men. But the principle was powerful. The empire attempted to recruit people based partly on knowledge. Long before modern states discussed technocracy, China had already understood that a large country could not be governed by swords alone. It required records, engineers, administrators, and educated officials. These old institutions would disappear, return, and transform many times. But one idea would remain deeply embedded in Chinese political culture. A strong civilization must be organized. During later dynasties, particularly the Tang and Song periods, Chinese cities became centers of trade, culture, and invention. Chinese porcelain traveled across continents. Chinese tea became desired around the world. Chinese workshops produced silk, metal goods, and luxury products that foreigners desperately wanted. For long periods, China was among the largest and wealthiest economies on Earth. Its rulers saw their empire as the center of civilization. But great success can create a dangerous illusion. When a civilization remains powerful for centuries, it may begin to believe that it has nothing left to learn. China continued producing remarkable scholars, merchants, and inventions. But its political system often prioritized stability over disruption. Merchants could become wealthy, yet officials generally held greater social prestige. New technology existed, but it was not always transformed into large-scale industrial production. Meanwhile, Europe was changing. European states competed violently with one another. They built ocean-going fleets, expanded overseas empires, and developed modern financial institutions. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Coal-powered machines multiplied production. Factories replaced workshops. Steam engines transformed transportation. Modern weapons transformed warfare. China still possessed an enormous population and a respected civilization, but the balance of power was moving. Slowly at first, then catastrophically. By the 19th century, European powers wanted greater access to Chinese markets. Britain bought enormous quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China purchased comparatively fewer British products. To change the balance, British merchants expanded the illegal sale of opium into China. Addiction spread. Silver flowed out of the country. When Chinese authorities attempted to suppress the opium trade, Britain responded with military force. Chinese soldiers faced modern warships, artillery, and industrially produced weapons. China lost the First Opium War. Then it was forced to sign unequal treaties, open ports to foreign trade, and surrender Hong Kong to Britain. Further wars brought further concessions. Foreign powers carved out special privileges and zones of influence. Japan, itself rapidly industrializing, also defeated China. The empire that had once considered itself the center of civilization was now being divided, pressured, and humiliated by outsiders. This period, beginning around the Opium Wars and extending into the 20th century, became known in Chinese historical memory as the Century of Humiliation. But foreign invasion was only one part of the disaster. Inside China, enormous rebellions killed millions. The Qing government struggled to modernize. Officials attempted reforms, built arsenals, and purchased foreign technology. But political resistance and institutional weakness slowed change. In 1911, the last imperial dynasty collapsed. More than 2,000 years of imperial rule came to an end. But democracy and stability did not immediately replace it. China fractured. Warlords controlled different regions. Political factions fought for power. Japan invaded Manchuria and later launched a devastating full-scale invasion. Cities were bombed, civilians were massacred, millions were displaced. Nationalists and communists fought Japan and then fought one another. By the middle of the 20th century, China was not an emerging superpower. It was an exhausted battlefield. This humiliation created a powerful national obsession. China must never again become weak enough to be controlled by foreign powers. That fear would later fuel its factories, military programs, infrastructure projects, and technological ambitions. China's modern rise was not driven only by a desire for wealth. It was driven by the memory of helplessness. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. After decades of fragmentation and war, most of mainland China was again controlled by a single central government. The new communist state wanted to rebuild the country, eliminate the old landlord system, expand basic education, and transform an agricultural society into an industrial power. China developed heavy industries, expanded state control, and received technical assistance from the Soviet Union. But Mao did not want China to industrialize slowly. He wanted it to leap forward. In 1958, the government launched the Great Leap Forward. Rural communities were reorganized into communes. Farmers were pushed into massive collective projects. People were encouraged to produce steel in small backyard furnaces. Local officials faced pressure to report impossible production successes. When false reports moved upward, grain was taken from communities that did not actually possess the harvest officials claimed. The result was not a miraculous economic leap. It was catastrophe. Agricultural disruption, policy failures, coercion, and false reporting contributed to one of history's deadliest famines. Years later, the Cultural Revolution created another period of upheaval. Students formed Red Guard groups. Teachers, officials, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were publicly humiliated, attacked, or imprisoned. Universities were disrupted. Cultural sites were damaged. Families were divided. China did build elements of an industrial base during the Mao era, while literacy, public health, and state capacity improved in important ways. But progress came alongside enormous human suffering, political repression, and disastrous experiments. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was united and independent. But it remained poor. Its economy was inefficient. Its technology lagged behind advanced countries. Many Chinese families had survived revolution, famine, and political campaigns. They had been promised a new world, but millions were still waiting for a better life. Then, in 1978, China made the decision that changed everything. Deng Xiaoping was not interested in protecting economic ideas simply because they sounded ideologically pure. He cared about results. A phrase commonly associated with his practical approach captured the new philosophy. It did not matter whether a cat was black or white, as long as it caught mice. China would remain politically controlled by the Communist Party, but economically, it began experimenting with markets, private incentives, and foreign investment. Collective farming was gradually loosened. Many rural families were allowed to make production decisions and sell surplus crops. Agricultural output rose. Small businesses appeared. Local factories began producing simple consumer goods. Most importantly, China created special economic zones. Places such as Shenzhen were allowed to offer different rules, attract foreign capital, and experiment with export-oriented industry. At the time, Shenzhen was a relatively small border area beside Hong Kong. Within a few decades, it became a vast technology and manufacturing metropolis. Factories arrived because China offered something extremely powerful: a huge labor force, low production costs, improving infrastructure, political stability, and a government determined to become industrialized. Foreign companies brought money, orders, technology, and management experience. Chinese workers produced toys, clothing, electronics, and household products for customers around the world. At first, many of those products were inexpensive and relatively simple. Made in China became associated with cheap mass production. But China understood something many countries failed to understand. You do not begin industrialization by immediately producing the world's most advanced machines. You begin by learning how factories work. You learn logistics, you train workers, you build ports, you develop suppliers, you improve quality. Then you move upward. Since the beginning of reform and opening in 1978, China's economy grew at an average rate exceeding 9% for many years. Close to 800 million people escaped extreme poverty according to the World Bank. This remains one of the largest and fastest reductions in poverty ever recorded. It did not mean that every Chinese citizen became wealthy. It did not eliminate inequality, exploitation, or harsh working conditions. But hundreds of millions of lives changed. Families who had survived on farms moved into cities. Children of poor laborers entered schools and universities. Villages gained roads, electricity, and telecommunications. Human history had rarely witnessed transformation on that scale. During the 1980s and 1990s, China built an industrial machine. Coastal provinces became manufacturing centers. Ports expanded. Roads connected factories with cities. Power stations supplied growing industrial regions. Local governments competed to attract companies. Foreign businesses saw enormous opportunities. Western consumers wanted cheaper products. Western corporations wanted lower manufacturing costs. China wanted jobs, technology, and access to global markets. The arrangement appeared beneficial to everyone. Companies moved production to China. China manufactured their goods. Consumers received lower prices. Corporations earned larger profits. But with every factory transferred, China learned. Chinese suppliers learned how to produce components. Chinese managers learned how global businesses operated. Chinese engineers studied imported machines. Chinese companies began competing with the foreign businesses that had once trained them. In December 2001, China officially became a member of the World Trade Organization. That decision tied China more deeply to global commerce. Exports accelerated. Foreign investment increased. Cities expanded at extraordinary speed. China became the factory of the world. But cheap labor alone does not explain what happened. Many countries had low wages. Few built an industrial ecosystem as complete as China's. A manufacturer in China could often find raw materials, components, packaging, engineers, assembly workers, shipping companies, and enormous ports within the same industrial region. China was no longer merely offering cheap workers. It was offering speed. And in business, speed can be more valuable than low wages. An idea could become a prototype could become a product, and millions of products could be shipped around the planet. While other countries debated individual projects, China built entire industrial cities. Factories cannot dominate global trade without infrastructure. China therefore poured enormous resources into roads, ports, airports, power plants, telecommunications, and railways. Villages were connected to markets. Industrial zones were connected to ports. Cities were connected to one another. In 2008, China began operating its modern high-speed railway system. By the end of 2025, its operational high-speed rail network had passed 50,000 kilometers, the largest network of its kind anywhere on Earth. A journey that once consumed an entire day could be reduced to several hours. Workers, students, engineers, and business people could move between cities more easily. Knowledge traveled faster. Investment spread inland. Factories could reach suppliers and customers more efficiently. Not every project was profitable. Some local governments accumulated major debts. Some stations served relatively small populations. Entire developments were sometimes constructed before sufficient demand existed. But the strategy revealed the logic of Chinese development. Do not wait for the economy to demand every piece of infrastructure. Build infrastructure that allows a larger economy to emerge. China also built some of the world's busiest ports. Its construction companies gained experience completing enormous projects quickly. These companies then began working abroad, building roads, dams, power plants, railways, and ports across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. In 2013, China announced the Belt and Road Initiative, an international infrastructure and connectivity program involving dozens of countries. Supporters saw investment and development. Critics saw debt, political influence, and strategic dependence. The World Bank concluded that improved transport corridors could reduce trade costs and increase economic integration, while also warning that projects required transparency, debt sustainability, and environmental safeguards. Ancient China had once connected itself to the world through the Silk Roads. Modern China was attempting to build new ones, this time using steel, concrete, ports, digital networks, and finance. For years, critics described China as a country that copied Western technology. There was truth behind some accusations. Foreign businesses complained about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and unfair government support for domestic firms. But copying was only one stage. China invested heavily in universities, engineering, scientific research, and industrial development. Millions of students studied science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Chinese companies moved from assembling foreign products to designing their own. China became a major competitor in telecommunications, drones, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, batteries, renewable energy, robotics, and space technology. In the Global Innovation Index for 2025, China entered the global top 10 and remained the highest-ranked upper-middle-income economy. Chinese applicants filed around 1.8 million patent applications worldwide in 2024, far more than applicants from any other individual country. Patent numbers do not automatically prove that every invention is revolutionary, but they reveal the scale of China's scientific and commercial ambition. China also became the largest manufacturing center for electric vehicles. Its companies developed cheaper battery technologies, highly integrated supply chains, and intense domestic competition. According to the International Energy Agency, China produced nearly 3/4 of the world's electric cars in 2025. China dominates large sections of solar panel and battery supply chains. It has its own satellite navigation system. It operates the Tiangong space station. It has landed spacecraft on the moon and sent a mission to Mars. The country that once imported basic industrial technology was now competing in space. And this may be the most important stage of China's rise. Cheap products made China wealthy. Advanced products could make China powerful. China's greatest weapon may not be its army. China's greatest weapon is its ability to build faster, cheaper, and on a scale that the rest of the world is still struggling to understand. China was once the factory of the world. Now, it wants to become the architect of the future.